We're back. This One Time in Real Estate, Season 2, Episode 29.
29.
Common pitfalls in the real estate transaction. Mm-hmm. Sounds a little tricky. Mm-hmm. What you thinking over there? Are the pitfalls getting like more or less nowadays?
Well, in this case, with the topic we're going to talk about today, I think they're getting worse. And it's funny, a few episodes ago, we talked about investors. And I feel like this also kind of relates to that because occupancy is something that you have to do as an investor, especially if you're renting a property or selling it. And then you also have to deal with occupancy when you're in real estate and working through a transaction, whether you're representing a seller or a buyer. And I think that for a variety of reasons, the codes keep changing for occupancy, like yearly, and because of that, they're just getting more and more. They're getting increasingly more difficult to manage. And a lot of the time, in my experience, or with our agents, I've had a lot of conversations about this lately. I think sellers don't understand what even can qualify on occupancy, like what can fail on occupancy, and that it can be very costly. And when they don't have the money, that's an issue. And then I think also agents don't always realize even which municipalities, in our case, in St. Louis, which municipalities have occupancy requirements, and then they're not able to properly advise their client, and it can just be a mess. So
on a high level,
yep.
I'm a buyer, you're a seller. Mm-hmm. I write a contract with you, and I'm and it's in a municipality that would require an occupancy, which is an inspection, and then it certifies that it allows me to occupy the home with my family, or in the case if I were to buy it as an investment, that my renters can occupy.
Correct.
So in a standard, very, very high level, is it automatic as a seller that you're going to give me clear occupancy?
So it depends on the contract.
Right? No, in a standard contract.
Oh, on a standard contract, yeah. Yes. It's that you're going to get it.
That you're going to get it.
Correct.
What about that you're going to clear it?
Oh, no, it is not.
Okay, so there's a nugget right there.
Right.
Is that number one, in the standard contract in the state of Missouri, that the seller is going to get occupancy inspection,
correct,
but
right,
not provide clear and free occupancy. They're going to get the inspection done. And then what is the next step? So it failed. There's 20 items on there.
Yep.
Does that then go back to the buyer for the buyer to review, and can they terminate or can they not?
Yeah, so we have this happening right now. So the seller has to order occupancy and have it done, and then they have 15 days in which, if they get it back during that time and they don't want to fix something, they can then go back to the buyer, and essentially it becomes another round of negotiation.
But there is, and again, we don't need to get into the specific dates,
right,
because I actually, honestly, without somebody asked me a question about a specific contract, pull out the contract, let's read it word for word. I'm not going to profess, I've been in this business for years, I'm not going to profess I remember the 15 days Sarah just said, or the tenor. But there is certain requirements that in occupancy, if that time period is missed by the seller, then the seller automatically has to provide clear and free.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Clear occupancy, yes.
So let's talk about this. If the seller follows the rules and does it in the right timing, they have to just order occupancy, but they don't have to provide clear and free. It's a negotiation.
Correct.
If they miss those critical deadlines, now they have to get the occupancy inspection, and then they have to make sure the seller makes sure it's clear and free.
Yes.
Now, the buyer, though, when they write their original contract, what's the easiest way to mitigate that negotiation?
Yes, so what we did for a very long time on our team was in the special agreements, we just said seller to provide clear occupancy. So they don't just do the occupancy, they actually have to clear it so that ultimately the buyer can move in and occupy the property at closing.
Protecting the buyer by writing in the special agreements, seller to provide clear occupancy. That means Ignore that. That is going to overwrite the paragraph where there's this negotiation and other. That is conservative. Yeah. And by the way, there's two hats. There's the buy side hat and the seller. Mm-hmm. If I'm representing that seller, I'm preparing them. They're telling you, regardless of anything, you have to provide them clear occupancy. If there's anything that fails, if there's permits that were from 3 people ago that were not closed out, you're going to have to figure out how to get those closed. If there's violations, you're going to have to clear the violations. Buyer, it's a beautiful thing because you're investing dollars on appraisal, you're investing inspection dollars, all of these dollars all in, and your emotional excitement. And then the occupancy comes and there's negotiation, but not in this case. Wearing the buyer agent hat, I'm protecting you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. Seller to provide clear occupancy. Mm-hmm. Now, this is about understanding the contract. What you don't hear me talking about is the critical dates, because if I'm going over it with my buyer, I'm going to review it word for word. But the concept that Sarah and I understand about occupancy is the basis of this conversation. You don't have to know word for word the dates. Mm-hmm. And actually, I would prefer for you not to know those word for word. You can know them in the way, way back of your mind, but please refer back to the contract, because the contract is what is actually the set in stone. That's what the buyer and seller are agreeing to, not what's in your mind or your mind, right, but what's on the paper. So fast forward, where's our problem?
Well, so a couple things. In our market, as the competition continues to increase, a lot of sellers are asking for special sale contracts. So what that does is removes municipal inspection. So that's an interesting little loophole, because buyers want to win. Buyers want their offer to win. That's such an emotional time when you're competing for a home to begin with, because you're like, wait a minute, I have the money, I'm ready, willing, and able. I'm giving them what they're asking, and now I have to move the goalpost and give them more than what they're asking, waive my protections, which gives me more risk. There's a lot of, obviously, things involved in that. But I think it's important that, in this case, it would be buyer agents understand what that looks like if their buyers waive the opportunity for the sellers to get that occupancy, because ultimately, if they're doing it later, because they aren't the owner, so it's tricky in itself to purchase occupancy or to order occupancy on a home that you don't own is tricky. You have to get that approved. And then if you're doing it after, that means you can't occupy right away after closing, potentially. So, and then like Mark said, there's a lot of things that can come up. For us, in our case, when I purchased my home, they had filled out the seller's disclosure. I actually don't know if I should. Nobody knows where I live, I guess. But the sellers had filled out the seller's disclosure and said that they finished their basement during their ownership and didn't pull permits. So you're like, ooh, that's tricky. And we were purchasing it on a special sale contract. So we had to order the occupancy ourselves. Thankfully, we have a bulldog TC on our team. Shout out to Dawn. And so she told me, hey, you need to do your occupancy inspection during your inspection period, so that we had that protection. So if it came back that the inspector said, when was the basement and it became just a can of worms, that we could actually get out during that time. So that was a protection that also, like if you have an agent, that they should tell you. But man, there are so many. I had one too where I didn't realize, buying in Jefferson County, didn't realize that they had occupancy, and we purchased, we went under contract, did our typical inspections, did sewer, did all the things that we recommend. And then it turned out that in that municipality, sewer inspection was a municipal inspection that the sellers had to order. And luckily they knew that. The agent there worked in that area all the time, so he had ordered it. And it turned out that the sewer was actually destroyed. And our inspector thought that was the main that they were seeing on their camera, but it was actually like the sewer was just completely obliterated. And so anyway, it ended up, thankfully, due to that occupancy requirement, the seller ended up having to repair the sewer. But that would have been a sticky situation for us where it's just, I can't even emphasize how important these things are.
And it all goes back to really understanding the contract. We talk about getting confidence. We talked about it earlier. How do you get confidence with knowing that it's a good house, meaning for your buyer's perspective? Previewing, knowing the market, knowing the alternatives. When you walk into this is a great house because we already saw those three. This is priced less. It's a little bit bigger, better location, or this isn't as good. So compare, contrast. How do you raise the bar? You raise it by educating yourself. How do you get education? Is you actually preview, right? But also studying the contract. Studying the contract gives you confidence. When you have confidence, you're giving the buyer more certainty and letting them make the decision. The worst thing that can happen is when that goes awry and the buyer's like, why didn't you tell me about that?
Yep.
Well, I didn't know myself, or we did discuss it. A matter of fact, we take it a step further, not on a special sale, because a special sale is a special sales contract where it's very clear what is included and not. But when somebody waives an appraisal, waives a survey, waives an inspection, we actually make them sign waivers. And you'd be shocked at how many times there's waivers that are signed for somebody allowing, say there's a survey and they're not going to do a survey against our advice. They don't do it, and then there becomes an encroachments that are pretty big, and then you have to get that survey out 4 years later when they go to sell the home and say, look, you didn't address this. Because the first thing a buyer, and I respect that, a buyer that becomes a seller is always going to ask, well, how come you didn't tell me about that? How come we didn't find that? Why didn't we ask for it? Well, actually, you were aware of it. We just didn't do it. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, that's really my thought process on really understanding. It is critical to understand the contract. You have a fiduciary duty to your buyer or seller to ensure that everything goes the best as possible, giving them the best opportunity to succeed, but make educated guesses, or not educated guesses, make educated decisions, not guesses. Guesses are when you don't know and you're just guessing.
Well, and also just going back to previewing for myself and for our new agents, we have them shadow inspections because the greatest way to have more comfort with these things is to hear and see them happen multiple times. And then you'll start to get into a rhythm. If they say asbestos taping, you're going to be like, okay, that's not necessarily the end of the world. I'm familiar with that. I remember that conversation we had. Or if there's so many things that when you've never gone to an inspection, you have no idea what they're talking about. The loop on a dishwasher, okay, does that sound like it's a big deal? No, it's not a big deal. But until you've seen the inspector point out that loop and how it's a code defect and they have to fix it, it's not a big deal, you're not going to know. And it's the same with municipal. So when you've seen enough municipal inspections, then you can say, oh, interesting. So Brentwood is a little bit more, or Webster Groves they're pretty serious on their occupancy. I need to make sure if my client's buying in Webster Groves, I let them know, they can be sticklers here. If my client's buying in U City, if my client's buying in Hazelwood, understand. And the best way to do that is to experience as many as you can. So leverage a team. If you're a newer agent and you don't have those yet, find someone that's doing some business and say, hey, can I just shadow you on your inspection? I want to meet a few inspectors. I want to understand what they're pointing out, because some inspectors typically follow the same protocol for the things that they sometimes are more fixated on, or the way that they inspect, and it's going to ultimately help your business overall.
The other thing is you can go to almost any municipality and actually what we look for, there's actually checklists and and it's almost called what we look for, what they look for. And it will give you a high level of overview of the different items that they're going to look for. Now, there is absolutely inconsistencies. We've had cases where there's been an inspector come out. They've come out for a re-inspection and it was a different inspector and they found new things. And so it can be extremely frustrating, but at the end of the day, the most important thing is understanding the contract, asking for seller to provide a clear occupancy. It really covers your seller. I mean, your buyer. It really just does. So there are those type of nuances. Again, the negotiations are becoming a little trickier as the market's changing right now because sellers still have high expectations of what they're willing to do and not willing to do. While the market's softening just a tad, buyers, there's a disconnect between buyers and sellers, and maybe we'll save it for another time, but we're seeing mutual releases happening where there's a disconnect between buyers and sellers because the sellers maybe took less than they would have 3 months ago, and with the expectation that a buyer's not going to ask for things, now a buyer knows the market's a little softer, they got a little better deal than they thought, so they see some crack in the real estate transaction. So now that buyer's asking for things, the seller's disappointed because now they have to give things and they just can't come together, and we're seeing really some impacts of that. So so the more you can agree up front, the better it is.
Yep.
And one of the easiest places to agree up front is what do you do with occupancy? Another great thing that we see people agree up front a lot is what do we do with appraisals? If there's an appraisal gap, they're being agreed. The seller and buyer agree that the buyer will make up $15,000 of the first part of the gap, or the buyer will make up the $10,000 over the asking if there's a gap. So there's many numerous ways to document it, but the key is the more that you make agreements up front. I always took an approach is if I went to a house and I saw that they had 5 broken thermal seals and they had electric disconnected in 3 things because it was going to start a fire or something, up front in the contract, seller to replace 5 broken thermal seals, seller to ensure that the electric is in safe working condition, certified by a certified electrician. Because why, when I'm already emotionally engaged in it, then start negotiating? Many people are afraid to negotiate up front. It depends how emotionally engaged you are. But as the market's changing a little bit, we're going to see some of those. But don't ever be afraid to set expectations up front, document it in the contract. Anything else?
I think that's a wrap.
You just took a picture. What was that for?
Just because I always forget to take pictures of us doing this.
Really?
Yeah.
All right.
So I have to document.
That's it.